If the system tells you not to save someone, it's usually because they matter. The wind screamed across the barren flats, carrying fine grains of metallic dust that hissed against Ethan Cole's visor like static. His boots sank half an inch into the ashen ground with every step, the suit's servos whining softly as they compensated for the drag. 37 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping, according to the dim readout flickering in the corner of his HUD. The storm wasn't natural. Nothing on this planet was. Ethan exhaled slowly, watching his breath fog the inside of his helmet before the filters cleared it away. He should have stayed with the wreck. That's what protocol said. Stay with the wreck. Wait for a signal. But the signal had died 12 hours ago, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the gravity here. A sharp tone cut through his thoughts. His HUD pulsed red. Target designation detected. Priority, high. Do not engage. Do not assist. Ethan frowned, squinting through the distortion of blowing dust. Yeah, that's not suspicious at all, he muttered, voice low, more to break the silence than anything else. The scanner painted a faint outline ahead, barely visible through the storm, tucked beneath the twisted skeleton of something that might have been a shuttle once. He hesitated. Orders were clear. His kind had learned the hard way that not everything that looked helpless actually was. He adjusted his grip on the small multi-tool at his side, not quite a weapon, but solid enough to feel like one. Another gust of wind slammed into him, harder this time, pushing him half a step back. The structure groaned, metal flexing with a tired, hollow sound. Something about that sound pulled him forward. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was stupidity. Ethan moved closer, boots crunching against frozen debris. The heat signature sharpened. Smaller than expected. Too small. He rounded the edge of the wreckage and stopped. For a moment, the storm seemed to quiet, like the world itself was holding its breath. She was half buried beneath a collapsed panel, one arm pinned, the other curled weakly against her chest. Her skin, blue, but not uniform, more like gradients of ocean under shifting light, was dulled by dust and cold. A faint shimmer ran along her surface, irregular, like a failing signal. Her eyes snapped open the second his shadow crossed her. Bright, alert, not afraid, not exactly. Calculating. Even like this. Ethan felt the warning flash again across his HUD. Do not assist. He stared at it for a long second. Then he reached up and tapped the side of his helmet. The warning blinked and disappeared. Yeah, he said quietly, kneeling down beside her, the cold seeping through the joints of his suit. I've never been great at following instructions. The metal panel above her shifted slightly as another gust rolled through, threatening to settle deeper. Ethan braced one hand against it, testing the weight. Heavy, awkward, doable. He glanced at her again. She hadn't looked away. Not once. I'm gonna move this, he said, voice steady, simple. Try not to fight me. Her lips parted slightly, as if forming words his translator hadn't caught yet. Then she stilled, watching him instead. Ethan tightened his grip and lifted. The panel resisted, then gave with a sharp groan, scraping against the wreckage as he forced it aside inch by inch. His suit strained, servos humming louder, heat spiking across his back. Finally, the pressure eased. He let the panel drop to the side with a dull thud. The storm rushed back in, louder than before. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Ethan reached down, careful, slow, and slid his arm beneath her shoulders. She tensed instantly, muscles tightening despite the obvious weakness. Easy, he murmured. If I wanted you dead, I would have kept walking. That earned the smallest reaction, a flicker in her eyes. Not trust. Not yet. But something close to curiosity. Ethan shifted his stance and lifted her free from the wreckage. She was lighter than he expected. Too light. The cold hit her immediately, and he felt the faint tremor run through her as he pulled her closer to shield her from the wind. His suit's internal heater ticked up automatically. All right, he said, glancing back toward the barely visible outline of his shelter half a mile out. Let's get you somewhere that doesn't try to kill you every 5 minutes. She studied his face through the visor, silent, searching, as if trying to understand a language that didn't quite exist yet. Ethan didn't look away. He just adjusted his grip and started walking. The shelter was nothing more than a fractured cargo pod half buried in the dust, its outer plating scarred, and it seems hissing faintly as it struggled to keep pressure, but to Ethan it felt like a fortress compared to the open storm. He ducked inside, dragging a sheet of torn insulation across the entrance to break the wind, and for a moment the noise outside dulled into a distant, restless whisper as the internal temperature crawled up from near freezing to something barely survivable. He lowered her carefully onto a strip of thermal padding. watching the way her body reacted to the slight warmth, the faint shimmer along her skin stabilizing just a fraction. His suit chimed softly, warning of rising energy drain, and he reached back to manually lower the output, redirecting most of it toward her instead. "You are not going to like this place," he said under his breath, pulling off his gloves and flexing his fingers as the cold bit into his skin. "But it is the best I have got." She did not answer, but her eyes tracked every movement, sharp despite the exhaustion weighing them down. Ethan knelt beside a cracked utility panel and pried it open, exposing a mess of wires and a flickering battery core that pulsed weakly like a dying heartbeat. He worked quickly, hands steady out of habit, rerouting power to a small heater unit that sputtered once before coming alive with a low hum. The air shifted, just enough to take the edge off the cold. Behind him, there was a soft sound, not quite a voice, more like breath catching on something fragile. He glanced back and saw her trying to sit up, her movements controlled but strained. "Do not," he said quietly, already moving to steady her, one hand hovering just enough to help without forcing. She paused, studying him again, then allowed the support for a brief second before easing back down on her own terms. "Proud," he noted, even now. He grabbed a canteen from his pack and hesitated for a fraction of a second before offering it to her. "Water," he said simply, loosening the cap and holding it where she could reach. Her gaze flicked from the container to his face, as if measuring the distance between intention and deception. Then, slowly, she took it. Her fingers were colder than the air, brushing against his for just an instant before pulling away. She drank carefully, controlled, like someone used to scarcity or discipline or both. Ethan leaned back against the wall, letting out a quiet breath he had not realized he was holding, his eyes drifting to the small viewport where the storm smeared the world into shifting gray. The silence between them stretched, but it was not empty. It carried weight, observation, calculation. "You got a name?" he asked after a moment, voice casual, almost absent, as he adjusted a loose cable near the heater. No response at first, just that steady gaze. Then her lips parted slightly, forming a word his translator struggled to process. The sound layered, almost harmonic. It stuttered once, then resolved into something close. "Lyra." Ethan nodded once, accepting it without comment, as if names were the simplest part of this entire situation. "Ethan," he replied, tapping his chest lightly. She repeated it under her breath, the syllables unfamiliar but deliberate. Outside, a distant rumble rolled through the storm, deeper than wind, something mechanical, something searching. Ethan's head lifted instinctively, eyes narrowing toward the sound as his HUD flickered back to life with a faint pulse. Multiple signals, still distant, but moving. He reached over and dimmed the internal lights, the shelter dropping into a softer, shadowed glow. Lyra noticed immediately, her posture shifting, tension returning like a coiled spring. "That is not weather," she said, her voice steadier now, low but clear. Ethan did not look at her right away. He was watching the readings, the slow convergence of something he could not yet see. "Yeah," he answered quietly, adjusting the heater output one more time, making sure it stayed on her side. "I had a feeling it would not stay quiet for long." The sound came again, deeper this time, not carried by the wind but cutting through it, a low mechanical resonance that did not belong to this dead world. Ethan remained still, one hand resting lightly on the exposed wiring of the panel, feeling the faint vibration travel through the metal like a distant heartbeat. His HUD pulsed once, then again, each signal sharpening into distinct points moving across the map with deliberate precision. Not random, not drifting, but searching. Lyra had already turned her head toward the entrance, her expression tightening in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. "They are not hunting you," she said quietly, her voice steady but edged with something heavier. "They are looking for me." Ethan let out a slow breath through his nose, eyes still on the readout as he counted the signals. 1, 3, 6, more coming into range every second. "That usually means I picked the wrong person to help," he replied, but there was no accusation in it, just a dry observation shaped by experience. He reached over and powered down another non-essential system, the shelter dimming further until only the faint glow of the heater and the soft reflection of his HUD lit the space. Outside, the storm shifted, not weakening, but bending, as if something larger was pushing through it. Lyra pushed herself up again, this time with more control, her movements slower but intentional, her gaze locking onto him. You still can leave, she said, each word measured, as if it carried weight beyond language. Distance yourself, and they will ignore you. Ethan finally looked at her, really looked, taking in the steadiness in her posture despite the tremor in her arm. The way she held herself, not like someone broken, but like someone contained. That is not how it works, he said, shaking his head slightly. Out here, once you are part of something, you are already part of it. The heater clicked, then flickered, the power strain catching up, and Ethan leaned forward to adjust the flow again, redirecting what little energy remained. His fingers moved quickly, practiced, but his mind was elsewhere, tracking distances, angles, options. None of them were good. A sharp beam of pale light suddenly cut through the dust outside, slicing past the narrow viewport in a slow, methodical sweep. Ethan froze for half a second, then reached up and killed the last external indicator on his suit. The shelter dropped into near darkness. Lyra's eyes reflected what little light remained, glowing faintly, not unnatural, just different, like starlight caught in deep water. The beam passed once, then again, closer this time. Ethan lowered his voice without thinking. How many? He asked. She did not hesitate. Enough. The simplicity of the answer settled heavily between them. Another pulse rolled through the ground, closer now, followed by a series of faint, synchronized tones that echoed through the storm like distant signals speaking to one another. Ethan shifted his position slightly, placing himself between her and the entrance without making it obvious, his body moving on instinct rather than decision. Lyra noticed anyway, her gaze flickering to him for a fraction of a second before returning to the entrance. Your kind calls this courage, she said softly, almost as if testing the word. But it is inefficient. Ethan allowed a small, almost invisible smile to form. Yeah, he murmured. We get that a lot. The beam stopped directly outside the shelter, holding steady now, the dust around it swirling in tight, controlled patterns as if held in place by something unseen. For a moment, everything went quiet again. The storm, the hum, even the faint creak of the metal walls. Then Ethan's HUD lit up one final time with a single line that made his jaw tighten just enough to notice. External contact imminent. He exhaled slowly, steadying his breath, and without looking away from the entrance, he spoke just loud enough for her to hear. Guess we are about to find out how important you really are. The light did not move away this time. It stayed fixed on the entrance, cutting a pale line through the hanging sheet of insulation as the wind pressed it inward and released it in slow, uneven breaths. Ethan did not reach for a weapon because he did not have one worth reaching for. Instead, his hand hovered near the manual latch he had rigged earlier, calculating how long it would take to seal the entrance completely if things went wrong. The answer was not long enough. The tone outside shifted, no longer scanning but communicating, a series of low pulses that repeated in precise intervals, structured, intentional. Lyra straightened beside him, the tremor in her body settling into stillness, her expression changing in a way that was almost imperceptible unless you were looking for it. Not fear, not relief, but recognition layered with something heavier. Something like responsibility. They have found us, she said quietly, not as a warning but as a statement of fact. Ethan exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled, eyes fixed on the thin barrier between them and whatever waited outside. Yeah, he replied. That was not exactly subtle. The pulses stopped. Silence followed, thick and absolute. Even the storm seemed to hesitate, as if giving space for what came next. Then a single, sharp tone sounded, close enough to vibrate through the metal beneath Ethan's hand. The insulation at the entrance lifted slightly, not torn, not forced, but moved with deliberate care, as though guided by something that understood fragility. A narrow opening formed, just enough for the light to spill inside in a clean, controlled beam. Ethan's eyes adjusted, tracking the source. A figure stood beyond the threshold, tall, motionless, its outline softened by the dust still drifting through the air. The armor it wore was smooth, reflective, catching the pale light and bending it into subtle gradients that echoed the same tones he had seen in Lyra's skin. No weapon was raised, no aggressive movement made, but the presence alone carried weight, the kind that did not need to announce itself. Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not backing away, his posture steady but not confrontational. You going to tell me if they are the kind that knock? He said under his breath, the faintest hint of dry humor threading through his voice. Lyra did not respond immediately. Instead, she drew in a slow breath, then shifted, pushing herself to her feet with a controlled effort that cost her more than she let show. Ethan moved instinctively to help, but she stopped him with the smallest motion of her hand, a silent request for space. She stood on her own, unsteady for a fraction of a second before finding balance, her gaze fixed on the figure outside. When she spoke, her voice was different, not louder, but carrying a clarity that cut through the air like something sharpened. The words were not entirely translated, the system struggling to keep pace with the cadence. But the meaning came through in tone alone. It was not a plea. It was not a greeting. It was command. The figure outside responded immediately, lowering its head in a precise, measured motion that was unmistakably deferential. Behind it, more shapes emerged through the thinning veil of dust, forming a line that extended beyond what Ethan could see, each one mirroring the same posture, the same stillness. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly as the realization settled in, not sudden, but heavy. He glanced at Lyra, taking in the way she held herself now, the subtle shift from survival to authority, the quiet gravity that had always been there, but hidden beneath exhaustion. "You were not kidding," he murmured, almost to himself. Lyra did not look at him. Her focus remained on the figures outside as she took a single step forward, crossing the threshold of the shelter without hesitation. The wind caught her immediately, lifting strands of her hair, tracing the faint glow along her skin, but she did not react to it. She stopped just beyond the entrance, standing between Ethan and the line of armored figures, her silhouette framed by the pale light and the endless storm. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, as one, the entire line shifted, lowering further, the gesture synchronized with a precision that spoke of discipline far beyond anything Ethan had seen. Not a threat, not an attack. Something else entirely. Ethan remained inside the shelter, watching, the cold creeping back and around him as the heater struggled to keep up, his mind catching up to what his eyes were already telling him. He had not just helped someone survive. He had stepped into something much larger without even realizing it. And for the first time since the signals appeared, the thought crossed his mind, quiet but undeniable. Whatever happened next was not going to be simple. The wind did not dare to touch her the same way anymore. Or maybe it only felt that way to Ethan as he watched from the shadow of the shelter. The storm still raging, but somehow less important now, like noise fading behind something far more deliberate. Lyra stood unmoving at the threshold, her posture straight despite the strain he knew still lingered beneath the surface, and the line of armored figures before her remained lowered, their stillness almost unnatural in a world that never stopped. Shifting, one of them stepped forward at last, slow and measured, stopping several feet away as if an invisible boundary had already been drawn. The surface of its armor shifted subtly, panels adjusting with soft clicks that carried through the air, and when it spoke, the voice was filtered, layered, not quite mechanical and not entirely organic, each word precise. The translator struggled for a fraction of a second before resolving. "You are located," it said, the phrasing odd but unmistakably formal. Command authority presence confirmed. Ethan let out a quiet breath behind them, the words settling into place in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Command authority. He leaned slightly against the metal frame of the shelter, arms loose at his sides, not interfering, not stepping forward, just watching as the situation unfolded into something he had no control over. Lyra did not respond immediately. Instead, she studied the figure in front of her, her gaze steady, her silence stretching just long enough to shift the balance of the moment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried that same clarity as before, calm but unyielding. "You delayed," she said, and there was no anger in it, only expectation. The figure inclined its head further, a deeper acknowledgement this time. "Transit interference occurred," it replied. Search grid expanded beyond initial parameters. Lyra's eyes flicked briefly toward the horizon, as if measuring something only she could see. Then, "Return to the figure. Withdraw the perimeter sweep," she said. "This location is secured." The words were simple, but the effect was immediate. Behind the lead figure, the line shifted almost imperceptibly as signals passed between them, a ripple of silent communication that spread outward into the storm. The distant hum Ethan had felt earlier began to change, pulling back, reorganizing. He exhaled slowly, tension easing from his shoulders without him realizing he had been holding it. Still, he did not move. He kept his distance, giving her space that felt suddenly necessary, like stepping into it would break something fragile and precise. The lead figure remained where it was, head still lowered. But there was a pause now, a hesitation that had not been there before. Additional presence detected, it said after a moment, and Ethan felt the weight of the words settle on him without needing to be named. Lyra did not turn around. She did not need to. "He is under my protection," she answered. And this time there was something else in her voice, something quieter, but stronger. Final. The figure processed the statement, the silence stretching just long enough to make the air feel tight again. Then it lowered its head once more, even further than before. "Acknowledged," it said. That was all. No demand, no question, no condition, just acceptance. Ethan blinked once, the simplicity of it catching him off guard more than anything else that had happened. He pushed himself off the wall and stepped forward just enough to be seen clearly in the pale light, not hiding, not presenting himself as anything more than what he was. One of the distant figures shifted slightly, but the lead unit did not move. Its attention remained fixed on Lyra. She finally turned then, slowly, her eyes meeting Ethan's through the dim glow spilling from the shelter. For a second, the storm, the soldiers, the entire planet seemed to fall away, leaving only that look. There was no longer the sharp edge of suspicion in it, no guarded calculation, just something steady, something that had changed, without either of them naming it. "You should return inside," she said softly, the command gone from her tone when directed at him, replaced with something almost considerate. Ethan let out a small breath that might have been a laugh if it had more energy behind it. "Yeah," he said, glancing past her at the line of figures that had come for her. "I think I am officially out of my depth here." Lyra held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod, as if acknowledging something unspoken, before turning back toward the storm and the army that waited for her next word. The storm resumed its place in the world the moment Lyra turned away from him, as if the brief stillness had only been borrowed, not earned. Ethan stepped back into the shelter without argument, pulling the torn insulation back into place, though now it felt more symbolic than protective. The presence outside far more controlled than the chaos of the wind. The heater clicked again, struggling, its output dipping before stabilizing at a low hum, and he crouched beside it out of habit, adjusting a loose connector even though he knew it would not make much difference. His eyes drifted toward the narrow opening, where the pale light still filtered through in steady lines, no longer searching, simply existing. Outside, the figures had begun to move again, but not in a rush, not in urgency. More like a system reordering itself around a fixed point. "Lyra," he exhaled slowly, resting his forearms on his knees, the tension that had carried him this far finally beginning to settle into something quieter, something heavier, not fear, not exactly, but awareness. He had stepped into a situation that had rules he did not understand, and yet somehow, he had not been removed from it. That alone said more than anything else. A faint shift of shadow crossed the entrance, followed by a softer tone than before, almost like a signal of completion rather than alert. Ethan glanced up just as Lyra stepped back inside. The storm clung to her for a moment, dust trailing along the edges of her silhouette before falling away as she crossed into the dim light. She looked different now, not in form, but in presence, as if the space itself adjusted around her without being asked. She paused just inside, her gaze sweeping the small shelter, taking in the exposed wiring, the failing heater, the makeshift padding, the signs of effort that had kept her alive. For a brief second, something in her expression shifted, subtle, almost too quick to catch, but it was there, recognition. "They will establish a perimeter beyond this point," she said, her voice quieter now, the earlier command replaced with something more grounded. "No further search patterns will enter this area." Ethan gave a small nod, accepting the information as it was given, not questioning the scale of what that meant. "Good," he replied, pushing himself up to stand, stretching his shoulders as the stiffness settled in. "I was running out of ways to pretend this place was secure." Lyra's eyes moved to him, studying him in that same measured way, but without the earlier edge. "You were never secure," she said, not unkindly, just factual. Ethan let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh. "Yeah, that tracks." Silence settled again, but it felt different now, less strained, more shared. Outside, the faint hum of distant engines shifted into a steady rhythm, organized, controlled, like something waiting rather than searching. Ethan walked over to his pack and pulled out another canteen, checking the remaining level before setting it within her reach without comment. Lyra watched the motion, her gaze lingering on the small detail before lifting back to his face. "You knew they would come," she said after a moment, not a question, but not entirely a statement either. Ethan shrugged slightly, leaning back against the wall, the cold metal pressing through the fabric of his suit. "I knew something would," he answered, eyes drifting toward the faint glow beyond the entrance. "Just did not expect it to be this organized." Lyra considered that, her posture easing just a fraction, the weight of command no longer pressing outward, but still present beneath the surface. "Most would have left," she said quietly. Ethan tilted his head, glancing at her with a faint, tired smile. "Most people have better instincts," he replied. That earned the smallest shift at the corner of her lips, not quite a smile, but close enough to matter. Outside, another signal pulsed, softer this time, like a distant acknowledgement. Lyra's attention shifted toward it, and for a moment, the distance between them returned, not physical, but contextual, reminding both of them where they stood in relation to everything else. She stepped closer to the entrance, stopping just short of crossing it again, her silhouette outlined by the pale light. "They will not remain idle for long," she said, her voice steady. "There are decisions to be made." Ethan nodded once, understanding more from the tone than the words. "Yeah," he said quietly, pushing off the wall. "Figured this part was coming." Lyra turned her head slightly, just enough to look back at him, her eyes holding his for a second longer than necessary. "And you," she added, softer now, "are part of that decision." Ethan blinked once, the statement settling in with a weight he had not anticipated, and for the first time since the army arrived, the situation shifted again, not in scale, but in direction. Whatever came next was not just about her anymore, and he could feel it in the silence that followed, in the way the storm continued to move around them, unchanged, while everything else quietly began to realign. The words stayed in the air longer than they should have, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore. Ethan did not respond right away, not because he did not understand, but because he did, and that made it heavier. He pushed himself upright slowly, the faint ache in his shoulders reminding him how long it had been since he stopped moving, really stopped. "That does not sound like a small decision," he said at last, voice even, eyes steady on her. Lyra turned fully now, facing him in the dim light, the storm behind her casting shifting shadows across her features. "It is not," she replied, and there was no hesitation in it. Outside, the distant hum deepened, not louder, but more layered, like systems coming online one by one, aligning into something far larger than what could be seen from the ground. Ethan glanced toward the entrance, then back to her. "So what are my options here?" he asked, not sarcastic, not defensive, just direct. Lyra studied him for a moment, as if measuring something beyond the question itself. "You may leave," she said. "A transport can be arranged to return you to your nearest human outpost." She paused, then added, "No record of this encounter will follow you." Ethan let out a slow breath, nodding once as if acknowledging the practicality of it. Clean, simple, efficient. He had seen that kind of solution before. It made sense. He stepped past her toward the entrance, not crossing it, just enough to look out at the figures still positioned in the storm, their silhouettes unmoving, patient. For a moment, he imagined walking out there, stepping into that structure, letting it carry him away from this place, from the weight of whatever this had become. It would be easy, easier than staying. He shifted his weight slightly, the metal beneath his boots creaking in quiet protest. "And the other option?" he asked, still looking outward. Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved closer, stopping just behind him, not crowding, but close enough that he could feel the faint warmth she carried now. "You remain," she said softly, "as my witness." The words settled differently, not like an order, not like a request, but something in between. Ethan frowned slightly, turning his head just enough to look at her from the corner of his eye. "Witness to what?" he asked. Lyra's gaze shifted past him, out into the storm where the faint outlines of larger structures now began to emerge through the dust, descending shapes barely visible but unmistakably massive. "To what happens when two species decide whether to remain enemies," she answered. The simplicity of it landed harder than any complex explanation could have. Ethan stared out at the forming silhouettes, his mind catching up with the scale of what she was saying. This was not just retrieval. This was not just protocol. This was something planned, something deliberate. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "And you want me there," he said. More statement than question. Lyra's reflection flickered in the edge of his visor, her expression steady. I want you to see, she replied. What your choice means. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, then opened them again. The storm's still there, the army still waiting, the path forward no clearer than before. He turned back to face her fully now, the distance between them small, but no longer uncertain. You are asking a mechanic from nowhere to stand in the middle of something way above his pay grade, he said, his tone calm but grounded. Lyra held his gaze without flinching. I am asking the only person who chose without obligation, she answered. That stopped him. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was accurate in a way he could not argue with. The heater behind him clicked again, a small, fragile sound in a moment that felt anything but. Ethan glanced at it briefly, then back at her. And if I say no, he asked quietly. Lyra's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened, just enough. Then you leave, she said. And this moment becomes a variable that was never observed. Ethan considered that, the phrasing strange but the meaning clear. It would be erased, not literally, but effectively. He would walk away. And whatever came next would happen without him. He looked past her one more time, at the figures, at the shifting outlines of something descending from above, then back to her. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of decision. Finally, he nodded, once, small but certain. Yeah, he said, voice steady. I am not great at walking away either. Lyra did not smile, not exactly, but the tension in her posture eased, just a fraction. Then prepare, she said, turning back toward the storm. Because what comes next will not wait. Ethan followed her gaze, the shapes in the sky growing clearer now, and for the first time, he understood that the moment he made that choice, everything had already begun to change. The sky did not open all at once, it unfolded, like something too large to arrive in a single moment. Ethan stood just outside the shelter now, the wind pressing against his suit as the descending shapes resolved into structure, smooth surfaces cutting through the storm without resistance, their edges catching faint light and bending it into shifting lines that felt more deliberate than natural. The ground beneath his boots vibrated in a steady rhythm, not chaotic like the wind, but controlled, synchronized with the presence above. Lyra stood a few steps ahead of him, unmoving, her silhouette framed against the vast forms lowering through the dust, and for the first time since he had found her, she did not look like someone recovering. She looked like someone returning. The nearest structure slowed as it reached a fixed point overhead, not landing, not touching the surface, simply holding position as if gravity itself had been negotiated rather than obeyed. A series of soft tones rippled outward from it, echoing through the line of armored figures below, each one adjusting their stance in perfect unison. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his eyes tracking the movement, trying to make sense of scale, of intention, of what exactly he had agreed to stand in the middle of. This is not just a pickup, he said under his breath, more to himself than to her. Lyra did not turn, but her voice carried back to him clearly. No, she said, it is not a path, formed without anyone announcing it. The armored figures shifting just enough to create a corridor that led from the shelter outward toward the open space beneath the hovering structure. No one gestured, no one commanded, but the meaning was unmistakable. Ethan hesitated for half a second, then stepped forward, the metal of his boots meeting the ground with a dull, grounded sound that felt almost out of place in the precision around him. Lyra moved at the same time, her pace steady, not hurried, not slow, and he fell and stepped just behind and to her side without thinking. The storm parted slightly along the path, not disappearing, but bending, as if redirected by unseen fields. As they walked, Ethan became aware of the subtle shift in attention around them, not directed at him with hostility, but with focus, like a variable being accounted for in real time. He kept his gaze forward, resisting the instinct to look around too much, grounding himself in the simple act of walking. The distance closed quickly, though it felt longer, stretched by the weight of the moment. When they reached the center of the formation, the tones above shifted again, lower now, deeper, resonating through the air and into the ground. A section of the hovering structure adjusted, panels sliding apart with seamless precision, revealing a soft, controlled light within. No ramp extended, no mechanical bridge lowered, just an open space that seemed to invite rather than command. Lyra stopped at the edge of that light, her posture straight, her presence aligning with something far beyond the small shelter they had left behind. Ethan stopped a step behind her, the warmth from the opening brushing against the front of his suit, a stark contrast to the cold that still pressed at his back. For a moment, neither of them moved. The entire formation held, waiting. Lyra turned her head slightly, just enough for her voice to reach him without carrying beyond. "From this point," she said, "they will look to you as well." Ethan blinked once, the statement landing with a quiet weight. "That does not make sense," he replied, his tone steady but honest. Lyra's gaze shifted forward again, toward the light. "It does too." "Damn," she said. Ethan followed her line of sight, the interior of the structure revealing shapes and movement that suggested scale far beyond what could be seen from the outside. He let out a slow breath, feeling the familiar instinct to step back, to retreat into something smaller, simpler. Instead, he adjusted his stance, grounding himself, and gave a small nod she could not see. Lyra stepped forward into the light without hesitation. After a fraction of a second, Ethan followed. As he crossed the threshold, the sound of the storm dropped away almost completely, replaced by a controlled, steady quiet that felt engineered down to the smallest detail. The air shifted, warmer, balanced, and for the first time since he had arrived on this planet, nothing pushed against him. He glanced back once, just briefly, at the path they had walked, at the shelter now barely visible through the dust, then forward again. The space ahead opened, structured and deliberate, filled with presence. But not noise. Lyra continued without slowing, and Ethan matched her pace, the reality of what he had chosen settling in fully now. Whatever this was, whatever came next, he was no longer standing outside of it. He was inside, and there was no version of this where he remained unchanged. The interior did not feel like a ship, it felt like a decision made physical. The air held steady at a precise temperature, neither warm nor cold, the kind that did not ask anything from the body. The floor beneath Ethan's boots responded with the slightest shift in resistance as he stepped, as if adjusting to his weight in real time. The walls were not walls in the way he understood them, more like surfaces that defined space without confining it, smooth and continuous, carrying faint lines of light that pulsed slowly, almost like breathing. Lyra moved ahead with quiet certainty, no hesitation, no need to look around, as if every step had already been mapped long before she took it. Ethan followed, his eyes moving despite himself, taking in details, patterns, trying to anchor himself in something familiar and finding very little. Figures appeared along the edges of the space, not approaching, not obstructing, simply present, their attention focused, their stillness deliberate. No one spoke. No one needed to. The entire environment carried a sense of expectation that did not require sound. The corridor opened into a wider chamber, and Ethan felt it before he fully saw it, the scale expanding, the air shifting just slightly, as if acknowledging a transition from one space to another. At the center stood a structure elevated by nothing visible, its form defined by intersecting planes of light and shadow that seemed to rearrange themselves depending on where he looked. Lyra stopped at its edge. This time, she did not turn back immediately. Instead, she stood there, silent, her posture aligning with something deeper than command, something older. The figures around the chamber adjusted subtly, not lowering fully, but shifting into a position that held both readiness and respect. Ethan slowed his steps, stopping a short distance behind her, close enough to hear, far enough not to intrude. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the structure at the center responded, its surface brightening in a controlled ripple that spread outward, like a signal being acknowledged. A voice followed, not from a single direction, but from the space itself, layered and calm, each word precise. The translator caught it cleanly this time. Command presence restored, it said. Lyra inhaled slowly, then spoke, her voice steady, carrying without effort. Status update, she said. The light shifted again, forming patterns that resolved into meaning more than image. Information conveyed in a way Ethan could not fully process but could feel in the rhythm of it. The voice continued, outlining movements, positions, outcomes, all in terms that suggested scale far beyond the planet they stood on. Ethan listened, not understanding every detail, but understanding enough. This was not a rescue. This was a pivot point. When the voice paused, Lyra stepped forward, placing herself fully within the light of the structure. "There is an additional variable," she said, and this time, she turned. Her eyes found Ethan without searching. Unplanned, but relevant. The chamber shifted, not physically, but in focus. Ethan felt it immediately, the attention redirecting, not aggressive, not invasive, but unmistakable. He resisted the urge to step back, holding his position, grounding himself in the simple act of standing. The voice responded, softer now, but no less precise. Identify. Lyra did not look away from him as she answered. He chose without directive, she said. He acted without expectation of return. The words settled into the space, and for a moment, nothing followed. Ethan felt the weight of that silence more than any sound that had come before. Then the light at the center shifted again, slower this time, more deliberate. Human, the voice said, addressing him directly. Ethan straightened slightly, not out of protocol, but instinct. Yeah, he replied, voice steady despite the scale of what he stood in. There was a pause, not empty, but measuring. Then the voice spoke again. Your action altered outcome probability. Ethan let out a small breath, something between a laugh and disbelief. I just helped someone who needed it, he said. Lyra's gaze softened, just slightly, but she did not interrupt. The light pulsed once more, and the voice responded. That is why it matters. The simplicity of it cut through everything else. No grand explanation, no complex reasoning, just that. Ethan stood there for a moment, the meaning settling in a way he could not quite articulate. Lyra turned back toward the structure, her posture steady, but something in her presence had shifted again, not in authority, but in acknowledgement. Proceed, she said quietly. The chamber responded instantly, the light expanding, the patterns aligning into something new, something that extended beyond this moment into whatever came next. Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just present. And in that stillness, he understood something he had not been looking for. He was not here because he was powerful, or important, or chosen by design. He was here because he had made a small decision in a place where no one was watching, and somehow, in a galaxy that moved on power and calculation, that had been enough. He did not raise his voice, he did not claim anything. He simply stood there, human, while an entire system adjusted around the fact that he had chosen to care.